What's up, everybody? Welcome to Omnipotent Health and Fitness episode number 4. Our guest today is a best-selling author and an associate clinical professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. He has published numerous peer-reviewed articles and has written 11 books, which have been translated into over 15 languages. His groundbreaking book, Spark, The Revolutionary New Science of Exercise in the Brain, truly sparked a revolution in how we think about the body-brain connection. So please help me in welcoming the man who once spent 10 weeks living with monks and whose books have helped me personally land my dream residency, Dr. John Ratey. Dr. Ratey, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Of course.
Delighted to be here.
Thank you. So I like to start my interviews with everyone's origin stories. At what point did you decide you wanted to be a psychiatrist? Was it something you knew you wanted to pursue as a kid, or was it later in life?
It was much later in life. It was actually in college. I was a philosophy and religion major and very interested in how the brain worked and how our sense of self developed. So I came to Boston after college and got a job in Mass Mental Health Center as an attendant, psychiatric attendant. And at that point, I was going to get a PhD in either philosophy or psychology. But then I realized and found that it was way better to have an MD if I wanted to do research. And especially when I got my job in 1970, believe it or not, we were just getting into this psychopharmacology. I mean, we were talking 66 was when we had stuff, when we really were using the antipsychotics in a big way. And in 1970, lithium we were starting to use, and the antidepressants came on board in the late 60s. So these were miracle drugs. And so I was interested in that. But more importantly, I was interested in figuring out how the brain worked and how we could manipulate it, and in psychotherapy as well as in with medicine. So it was really in that era that I decided to go back and do my sciences in a year and a half, and then go to medical school. That's how it started.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
That's amazing. So I came across your book, Spark, during medical school when I was studying for my USMLE Step 1. And I realized on the days that I was exercising that I was way more focused during my marathon study sessions. And after reading your book, I became like fanatical about making sure I was exercising first thing in the morning. And I guess I'm curious, what, you spoke about the in the 60s when, psychopharmacology was starting to come along. I'm curious what sparked your interest in how exercise affects the brain and sort of that body-brain connection.
Yeah, no, when I was in medical school, there was an article, and I was just a huge fan of the antidepressants. I thought this was, was life-changing for patients. But there was an article out of Sweden, or Norway, where they were using the antidepressants for people admitted to the hospital for depression, or an exercise program. They had a choice when they came in, and the results were about the same. So this really stimulated my interest in the effect of exercise on mood and all that. And then I became very interested in ADHD and started to explore that and talked about it. And one of the people that I spoke to heard me talking about ADD in adults, because that was a brand new thing. No one there was one paper in the literature, one paper about ADHD in adults back in 1980. And so I was seeing it in my inpatients, realizing that a lot of times we stop medicine too early. Anyway, so this one guy came to me and he said, "Look, can I come and see you?" And he was a marathoner all of his life, but had a bum knee now. And since he had his bum knee, he was no longer productive. He had all the adult symptoms, or had symptoms of ADHD as an adult because he stopped running. And this led me to really solidify my interest in exercise. And so eventually, when he got back to running, because he rehabbed his knee, didn't need medicine anymore, but so it really propelled me on to two careers, one in ADHD land and the other in exercise. So that's how it really began.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Oftentimes you don't really realize the path that you'll take until you come across these different experiences. And one of those experiences that seemed to really strike home to you was that time in Naperville, Illinois. How did you come across what was going on in Naperville at that time that you wrote about in the beginning of Spark?
Well, no, I was already talking about exercise, right? And lecturing about it on my earlier books on ADHD and on shadow syndromes and how the brain worked and all that. So I was quoted on Frontline back in early 2000, 2003 or so, because one of the people they had on, they were doing this whole thing on the obesity epidemic in our kids. And they had this guy on from Naperville who had revolutionized their PE program to make it, it was every day for 45 minutes, but he changed it up so that it was fitness first, as opposed to sports and athletics and, learning different movement ways and all that. But focused first on fitness, which was a real revolution at the time. And this led to them having 3% of their kids in their 19,000 student, school district. Only 3% were overweight.
Wow.
And the national average was 33%.
Right, that's incredible.
So, but what got me to Naperville on an airplane was 2 years before that, they had taken an international science and math test. And the 99% of the kids took it, and they came in #1 in the world in science and #6 in math. And this is a test that every country takes every 3 years. And usually the US is somewhere in the mid to high teens in terms of their placement in science and math. But they came in #1 in the world in science and #6 in math. So it jumped. I was convinced here was something that was really happening. And I went to Naperville and then wrote the book Spark off of that, because it was just so powerful.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. And I think something that was really cool that you mentioned is they really tried to make it a lot of fun and almost gamifying health and fitness for the kids. They incorporate things like the heart rate monitors, which became sort of a challenge to them. And they also incorporate things like Dance Dance Revolution. And I have friends that became very competitive in Dance Dance Revolution, actually lost a lot of weight playing games like that, which is absolutely astonishing and very outside of the box thinking for the folks at Naperville, which is incredible. I wanted to also talk about, you mentioned BDNF, and it works as a miracle grow for your brain. Could you talk more about BDNF, how it's related to exercise, and what does it do for you?
Well, BDNF was the wonder growth factor of the 90s and 2000 era. Everybody was talking about it because we learned about it in the 80s, but BDNF was seen as the fertilizer for the brain, kept our brain cells young and perky. And what we knew at that time is that when we exercise, we made a lot more of this BDNF. And what we knew later on is that when our nerve cells fire, we release this BDNF. And then we have a downstream target that sends back information to the presynaptic cell to make more. So there's a sort of self-propelling
Like a positive feedback loop of sorts.
feedback that our environment, evolution had given us this gift, that if we need it, it will come, and we will be able to do more, think more, move better, because that was the first order of business: to move better, move more predictably, remember what we did, sculpt our movements, all that led to us developing our big frontal cortexes that then became the areas that we think with. So one of the great quotes that I use all the time is that thinking is really the internal evolution of movement, that our moving brain really becomes our thinking brain. So we've had all these new brain cells that were associated with making us move the best, to be the evolutionary victors. And we co-opted those same nerve cells to think with.
Absolutely. I think that's a beautiful quote. Are there certain areas that BDNF concentrates in the brain?
Yeah, we make a ton of it in the hippocampus and in the prefrontal cortex. And we make it when our brain cells fire. So what we know about how our brains evolved is that a lot of our brain is involved with movement, with judging, with moving, with starting, with stopping, with sculpting, with making it smooth and continuous. All those are parts of the brain that evolve to make us better movers. So when you're moving, you're exciting those same cells. You're using them. They're clicking away. And when they click away, you release more BDNF, and then you make more BDNF, and you change just on that growth factor alone. And there are a lot of them, right? It's just BDNF is sort of the mother of all growth factors for the brain. But when we have more of that stuff, our brains grow. And when they grow, what we know is that when we learn anything, we have to grow in the information. So this is the magic. So when we move, we have more BDNF. Our brain cells are ready to grow. We have a new learning issue that's up there, and we can log it in. We can grow it into our brain.
Absolutely. And BDNF is sort of a neurotropic factor, whereas things like serotonin and dopamine, those are neurotransmitters. How do they differ, and what's going on to the neurotransmitters when we exercise?
Well, when we exercise, I mean, everything works better. I mean, when we exercise, we are using more brain cells, right? We're using, and we know that when we move, we use more brain cells than any other human activity. So think about that. When we move, we're using more brain cells. And when we use more brain cells, we liberate more neurotransmitters and more neurogrowth factors and all kinds of hormones that are very, very important, like the endorphins, like the endocannabinoids, like oxytocin, hugely important neurohormones. And the difference between the neurohormones is that they work all over the brain, whereas the neurotransmitters work only at their landing site to modulate. And the ones that you know about, that we know a lot about, dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, they are really a small part of the brain chemistry, but very important because they sculpt how our brain really functions, especially in things that in psychiatry that we're very interested in, like mood, attention, anxiety, response to stress, craving, all these parts of the brain that are involved with those key human factors.
Right. In your practice, how in the past, when you were writing Spark, it didn't sound like exercise was an identified treatment for things like depression. And now it's, I think in 2010, perhaps that has changed. How do you use exercise in your practice with your own patients? When do you prescribe it, and what are your uses for it?
Well, I use it all the time. I mean, it's one of the, certainly people coming to me these days know that I'm identified with that.
Right.
And they usually are aware of that. So, and so I instruct them on how this can really affect them, their anxiety or their addiction problems or their mood problems, or just in general, their learning problems. I mean, their attention. We just finished our 4th book on ADHD this last year.
Which was amazing, by the way, and I'd like to touch on that a little bit later in the interview.
Yeah, because in it, we only have 8 chapters, small chapters, because unbeknownst to us, the editor wanted a really short book, which is okay, but we wrote a very big book. But anyway, we had to cut all this stuff, but we kept the 2 key chapters, one on exercise, the other on balance and training, balance and coordination training, the cerebellum, because these are so important, as we've learned. I mean, we learned how important exercise is for attention, but also how balance and coordination are so important, because people who have weird brains, let's just call it that, they're not neurotypical. They have different brains, whether they're dyslexic or have problems with math or problems with writing, problems with reading, problems with taking in information or distributing it. They are really helped by a steady stream of exercise to help correct those things.
Right. When I was reading your book, ADHD 2.0, I was really struck by realizing that ADHD isn't necessarily just an inability to focus, but sometimes focusing too much on a certain subject. Could you talk more about that duality of ADHD for us and the audience?
Yeah, it's when we try to, even duality sort of raises some hackles with me. I mean, because there's so many different ways to think of what attention is, but one of them is you have too much or too little. And too much attention, you get hyper-focused on something. And the bad news is that oftentimes you get hyper-focused on things that you're worried about, things that are threats to your, your feeling of well-being, or you think, oh boy, I blew it. I should have started this earlier. I should have studied this before, for the test or for the paper that you're writing or whatever, or I shouldn't have procrastinated. And then you beat yourself up with that. And so you over-focus on the bad news. And this then prevents you from oftentimes from moving forward and makes your day pretty lousy and makes the rest of your attempt to do your work a bit more under strain, which when it shouldn't be. Right. So yeah, so that's one way of thinking about it, that we can hyper focus or hypo focus.
Right. And so what then does you talk about the cerebellum actually pretty extensively in ADHD 2.0, and I really enjoyed that section. What exactly is happening when we stimulate our cerebellum to help us with focus in different parts of our life?
Right. Well, it's not just focus. It's every higher brain function has a cerebellar component, or has balance and rhythm component. And we've only learned this actually from Mass General. Dr. Schmaumann back in 2008, wrote a great book on the cerebellum and called, said it's not just dysmetria, which means problems with movement and coordination with actual movement, but also dysmetria of thought, dysmetria of feelings. Things are not right. They're not firing in the nice, smooth, continuous kind of way. And if you listen to ADD people long enough, you hear this all the time. My thoughts aren't continuous. I stop and start. I get waylaid off of what I'm thinking about. Yeah. And it uses the same kind of language as people with movement disorders talk about. And in fact, the overlap of movement disorders and attention deficit disorder is huge. We know that almost 60% of people with dyslexia, with ADD, with autism have movement and coordination problems. So by training the cerebellum, by increasing movement and balance and coordination, you have a better shot at being better focused. I did a study up in upstate New York at the center I'm working with, or have worked with, on 26 very autistic adolescents. And we did an intensive 3-month training on their cerebellar function, balance and rhythm. And we had a remarkable change where their disruptive behaviors, their problem behaviors decreased, which we sort of expected, but we also saw an improvement in their time on task, which is a good way of measuring attention, and especially with social attention, which are big problems in that population. So by just working on their balance, having them walk the plank or stay on the Bosu ball or stay on the balance board, that this helped improve their balance and coordination, and also their behavior and their attention and their sociability.
Yeah, that's amazing. And quite anecdotally, I've noticed I have a 3-year-old, and we just enrolled him in actually karate and gymnastics. And on the days that we skip those days, he's really all over the place. But the days that we go, he seems like he's able to sit, he's able to color and really focus on what he's doing. So it's really quite interesting, and it's anecdotal, but for me as a parent, it makes a big, big difference.
Absolutely. And the martial arts are a great way of training the balance and training your coordination, obviously. Great way, because it really, you really use so much more of your brain than just by moving, just by running, or I mean, a 3-year-old is going to play and is going to have all kinds of movements, but when they're in something like karate or gymnastics, where they're learning to be in a certain position and a certain prelim to them really getting into the karate or getting into the martial arts, they have to spend time getting it right, getting their positioning correct before they advance, which is a great way to train attention as well as the cerebellum, to get them really working really, really well.
Absolutely. And it sounds like from reading your book that most of our concentration of neurons is actually in our cerebellum. Are there certain, we mentioned gymnastics and karate, but are there certain exercises that are more optimal for stimulating your cerebellum?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yoga is a great one. Very popular in all over the world, but in the US especially, is all about managing not just our body, but our brains. and getting our balance and coordination right. You know, doing the tree pose, you know, which I do with my trainer. You know, it's like that really demands a lot of balance and coordination. And that really, and if every kid, if every 4-year-old did the tree pose every morning, there'd be less problems with attention and disruptive behavior in the classroom. And you know, it's one of those things that really works if you work at it.
That's got to be my goal, is to try to get my son to do the tree pose every morning for 5 minutes. That'd be beautiful.
Yes. As well as like practicing his martial arts positions and you know, various movements and everything. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting. I was talking to your friend Tony Horton, and I asked him a similar question. You know, what's the one thing that you think everybody should be doing? And he actually mentioned yoga for his one thing that everybody should be doing across the board to best optimize their health, which is very interesting.
Yeah, no, but yeah, and I know Tony, and not very well, but well enough. I mean, my wife and I did a ninja training with him for 4 days right before COVID. So what an incredible man and guy to help change the world, you know. And so he's done a lot to help people.
Absolutely. I definitely, you know, I did P90X when I was younger as well. Shifting it back to Spark. So in your book, you discussed a case where you were testifying in court, and there was a lawyer that was trying to paint a picture in which exercise wasn't a legitimate treatment for things like anxiety and depression. And I'm curious if you could actually paraphrase what your response would have been to the lawyer in court during that time, because I was really curious what you would have said. Like, what exactly is happening when exercise, you know, specifically in regards to anxiety and depression? How does it help in those regards?
Well, of course, he was saying there's no evidence for it.
Right.
That this was helping my patient. There was evidence with that patient, but there was tons of evidence that I had written in Spark about the studies that we've done, double-blind, placebo-controlled studies on the use of exercise to treat mood, both acutely and chronically, as well as anxiety. So that we have the data. And what I said was, when we're exercising and a person who's depressed, and we start them exercising, we are changing their brain chemistry, much like our antidepressants do. Mm-hmm. It does the same kinds of things. So I said, look, I've always said that a bout of exercise is like taking a little bit of Prozac and a little bit of Ritalin, or change it up a little bit of whatever the current big antidepressant is, and sure, Adderall or Vyvanse.
Right.
Same thing. It does the same thing a little bit. So it helps with the focus. It helps with the mood. It helps with motivation. And we know this works. Right. We know that it helps. So that, and with my patient, it absolutely helped.
Yeah. That was a fascinating story. And another fascinating story that you spoke about one of your colleagues who was treating patients with agoraphobia. And I really love this, where he would track how fast that they could sprint over, you know, X distance. And agoraphobia, for those who don't know, is sort of fear of social situations or going outside or being in public. And so what your friend did was, or your colleague did, was they had them sprint towards a mall when, you know, the mall was closed. And if they started feeling anxious or anything like that, then just stop and turn and walk back. And this idea of running towards your fear, but walking back to safety, I find is incredibly interesting. Could you talk more about the effectiveness of this type of therapy, and if you use this strategy in your own practice or even your own personal life?
Yeah, no, there is so much that happens when you do like a sprint towards whatever, but towards something that you're afraid of, because you'll just continue to get closer to it and get away from the safety of your home. But when you're running that intensely, you are really changing your brain's chemistry, and that's what you need. So you're really elevating your serotonin levels, your dopamine, and your norepinephrine, and endorphins, our body's own morphine, and the endocannabinoids, our own marijuana factors that help calm you down,
Right.
help reduce the effect of stress on your brain. And agoraphobia is all about too much stress, too much worry, too much threatening ideas of what being outside means to you.
Right. Yeah. It's kind of interesting. It made me think about your book of Go Wild, and the idea of our stressors today are much different than the stressors of, ancestors and caveman days. And you talk about this idea of rewilding ourselves. What does that actually mean to you, and how would that help us in today's day and age?
Oh gosh, rewilding is such a great concept, isn't it? To really become like our the hunter-gatherer past, if you will. That's what real rewilding is about getting back to those activities, those ways of thinking, those ways of being that we evolved to be. And that's the point. We evolved to be moving, miles and miles each day, and not sitting in front of a screen like we are now, or like we are so much during our lives, but moving, being outside, which is hugely important. That's one of the great things about being here in Hawaii.
I was just about to say, it must be nice out there.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's outside all the time, I mean, it's amazing because the weather is, I hate to tell you, is so perfect. It gets up to 82 degrees like every day since we've been here, and we've been here almost 2 months. But it doesn't go much higher. It'll get hot in the summer apparently, but yeah, it's sunny most of the time, and inviting to be outside, not just to be in the water, although that's great, but all the hikes and the nature that's here. So being outside is important. Being with nature is important. Fellowship is so important as well. And one of the things that maybe if I were rewriting Spark, I would spend much more time on the effect of exercise on affiliation, on altruism, on our wanting to connect, because we have more evidence that exercise really boosts our oxytocin hormone, as well as all kinds of other changes in our brain that make us more likely to connect with others. So that's why you see people, when they're exercising, they want to join, like Tony Horton. He had P90X, so you saw Tony all the time, or you were with a group, or CrossFit, or it used to be the going running clubs or biking clubs or swimming clubs. Pre-COVID, certainly the running clubs were there, but people would be spinning clubs. People would join up, and now working with this 3 times a week out in the middle of the park here in Hawaii, they do Zumba. There's like 30, 40 women and men actually doing Zumba to this lady who's leading us and playing music, and it's like, and it led to all this affiliation. Like we got to know a whole group more of Hawaiians or people living in Hawaii that going to dinner, becoming friends with. I mean, it's sort of a natural. If you're moving, your brain, your body, you're much more liable to want to be with others.
Absolutely.
And today it's so important.
It is.
That's the rewilding. Rewilding is there.
It's kind of finding your tribe a little bit. I'm a big fan of group fitness workouts, and I did do CrossFit for some time, and the community that they can build around this idea of health and fitness and movement has been really amazing to watch them kind of grow as a company.
I worked with Reebok for 5 years, so I help with that movement to but CrossFit took off on its own. So, but anyway, that's another story.
That's awesome. I imagine you didn't choose Hawaii out of pure luck. What does getting outside in nature actually do for us physiologically? What's going on in our bodies?
Well, we know that if we spend too much indoors, our stress levels go up. You get outside, your stress levels drop. Simple. And if you're out in nature, it drops even further. Right. So that, and stress levels, meaning all the stress measures, not just cortisol, but ILD or IL-6, IL-8, all those factors shift. We become less, we reduce our chronic inflammation, which is really what we want to do. So we're much better when we're in nature and outside and with another. So your group exercise is such an important aspect of it. And your son, or 3-year-old being in with the dojo with other 3-year-olds running around being crazy, but trying to do the martial arts is phenomenal, because he'll make friends and he'll be with others and he'll have fun, and and he'll get it logged into his brain that this is a very good thing to do.
Absolutely. So I want to make sure that we leave enough time for a Q&A at the end. And so before I ask my final question, where can everyone follow your amazing work that you're doing?
Well, I have a nonprofit called Sparking Life, and there's a Facebook page, Sparking Life Facebook page, as well as we have a website that's updated every now and then, not as much as a Facebook page. Every 4 days a week, we put on a new article that's in the literature about the benefits of exercise and for the various disorders, for schools, for the elderly, because our big information really exploded in the 90s about exercise and its effect on the elderly. But anyway, that's one of the resources.
Awesome. So for my final question, if you could make all of humanity adopt one lifestyle modification that would most greatly impact their health, what would it be?
I think it's clear from all the anti-aging platforms, all the stuff that we know about, the problems with being so sedentary. It's moving. They're sort of realizing how important movement has been to us as an evolved species, and how important it is to us today, and especially with coming out of COVID, hopefully.
Yeah.
And being even more sedentary and sitting in front of Zoom, so much of the day, that movement is key and crucial.
Amazing. Well, Dr. Ratey, thank you so much for coming on to our show. We're going to move on to the Q&A, but guys, if you haven't read Spark or read any of these amazing works that he's done, ADHD 2.0, Go Wild, they're all incredible. And Dr. Ratey has really been integral in this whole movement towards body-mind connection. So if you haven't already, make sure to check out all of his work. All right, everybody, until next time. Thanks.